I have the great pleasure and the great honor to introduce you to Professor Alastair Hamilton. Professor Hamilton is the most distinguished expert in the history of European relations with the Arabic-speaking world. He is the Arcadian Visiting Research Professor at the Warburg Institute in London and the co-director of its new research center for the history of Arabic studies in Europe, CHASE, about which too I would like to say a few words in a moment. Before that, and first of all, I would like to express our gratitude to New York University, Abu Dhabi, to Professor Kennedy, and in particular to Niels Lewis, the program coordinator, for organizing this event and for hosting Alastair's lecture on the bridge of knowledge from East and from East to West tonight. It's a magical place you've chosen for this lecture, and with the creation of Saadiyat Island, Abu Dhabi underlines its ambition to be the most important cultural center in the region and a world-class destination for cultural tourism. Attracting and hosting millions of visitors, Saadiyat Island will be a cultural interface, an intercultural hub where guests from all over the world can meet and can get inspired by the global cultural heritage. It is exactly this creativity triggered off by cultural encounters and interfaces with which the Warburg Institute in general and the Center for the History of Arabic Studies in Europe in particular are concerned with. Cultures never develop and grow in isolation. They are built on the values of past generations, and they are shaped and challenged by the interaction with other cultures. It is this significance of cultural interfaces and encounters that is at the center of Abi Warburg's idea of Kulturgeschichte, of cultural history. And since the beginning, scholars at the Warburg Institute focused their research and their teaching on the impact which cultural encounters have had on visual and written art, but also on religion, politics, and society from the Middle Ages to the present day. But not only the influence of Greek and Roman antiquity on European culture has been of interest to Ernst Gombrich, Michael Baxendale, Arnaldo Momigliano, and all the other famous scholars that have worked at the Warburg. The European encounter with the Near East, and in particular with the Arabic-speaking world, has traditionally been studied and taught at the Warburg Institute too. In recent years, with the appointment of Alastair Hamilton and other members of staff, the transfer of knowledge and ideas from the Arab world to Europe has entered center stage. And in order to promote this most important area of research even further, London University and the Dean of the School of Advanced Study have generously supported our initiative to set up a research center for the history of European-Arab relations. Together with Charles Burnett, the professor for the history of Islamic influences in Europe, also at the Warburg Institute, Alastair Hamilton directs this unique and pioneering center, which has been launched a month ago with an international conference on translations of the Quran into European languages, which I think was a very successful event. And with these and other events, such as our next series of public lectures on Islam and the Enlightenment, with our publications, summer schools, and our web presence, we would like to pursue one major objective, namely to discover and to describe the shared history of Europe and the Arab world. He who does not know his past, His Highness Sheikh Said once famously said, cannot make the best of his present and future, for it's from the past that we learn. We think that knowledge and awareness of the shared history of Europe and the Arabic-speaking world is important in many regards. Knowledge of our common past is first of all essential for an adequate understanding of many of today's intercultural and interreligious tensions and clashes. But knowledge of our common history will also lead to the discovery of bridges, which can open up new ways of collaboration, of mutual inspiration, and to an exchange of knowledge, of ideas, and of visions for a common future. It is about such bridges of knowledge that Professor Hamilton will talk to us tonight. In fact, Professor Hamilton has devoted a great part of his scholarly work to the discovery of such bridges between Europe and the Arabic-speaking world, between Islam and Christianity in Europe and in the East. His most recent publications include a thorough study on the European discovery of the Egyptian Church, the Copts and the West. He has also written a book on the Western discovery of Oman and a veritable encyclopedia of the interface between East and West, the Arcadian Library, Western Appreciation of Arab and Islamic Civilization. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sure we will all enjoy Professor Hamilton's talk to us about bridges of knowledge from East to West. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Dr. Jan Loop so much for this introduction, too flattering, far too flattering introduction. But above all, I'd like to thank for the extreme generosity the New York University in Abu Dhabi and Niels Lewis, who's organized everything so beautifully, and Professor Kennedy for his introduction. And then I'd like to extend my thanks to a special friend of mine, to whom I really owe this visit more than anybody else, Dr. Robert Jones, for various reasons. First of all, Dr. Jones has for years talked to me about Abu Dhabi and has inspired me with some of his enthusiasm, which I'm now beginning, I must say, after a very short stay, to share. But there's another reason why I'd like to thank Dr. Jones so much, and that is that the illustrations I'm going to show you are all taken from books assembled at the Arcadian Library, which he himself assembled more or less single-handedly, and which give an extraordinary idea about the transference of culture. The advantage of books is that while relations between Europe and the Arab world have not always been as smooth as we might have wished, while there has in history been moments of very considerable conflict, with books one can reach a certain serenity. One can spot the very best moments of the contacts between the Arab world, Arabic culture, and the West. And we can also dispose of certain very common myths which circulated at a slightly lower level. Now, if we take as our first example an illustration of a scientific work. This is an illustration, a woodcut, at the beginning of a work by the great Persian astronomer Al-Farganus, also known as Al-Farghani. And it's an example, one of many, of a sort of work that dominated European scientific culture for almost 500 years. The Arab scientists, well, maybe I should say Arabic scientific literature, because very many of them were Persians, very many of them were Christians, writing in Syriac and translating from Syriac. The scientific contribution of the broadly speaking Arabic writing and Arab world was enormous. And it starts, of course, with the great translations made in Baghdad in between the 8th and the 10th century. And then it enters Europe with the translations made, first of all, in Toledo, in what's known as the Spain of the Reconquista, the Spain which had been reconquered from the Muslim forces by the Christian armies in the 11th century. And these translations into Latin were made by a team of scholars, and this is one example. El-Fraganus, although Persian by birth, worked mainly in Cairo and also in Baghdad in the 9th century. And as an astronomer, he had the most extraordinary influence on his European counterparts. But it wasn't only astronomy. Indeed, it was possibly less astronomy than medicine that came into Europe thanks to the Arabs. This is a manuscript dating from about 1300, and it's the work of a man who was right at the other end of the vast Arabic-speaking world, al-Zahrawi, known in the West commonly as Al-Bukassis, and he revolutionized surgery. European surgery was entirely dependent for many, many years on his designs of instruments, a rather sinister selection of instruments which would seem to be of torture, but which in fact were absolutely essential for health. And he, like his peers, was translated into Latin by the team working in Toledo. Now, science in Europe can be said to have been more or less dominated. I mean, what is extremely striking is the number of scientific works, the sheer number of scientific works which were either direct translations from the Arabic or which were by European scientists who'd been profoundly influenced by Arab scientists. And this is a process which lasts from the beginning of printing in the late 15th century well into the 17th century, when the medical works of the great philosopher and physician Avicenna were still standard reading at the majority of European universities that taught medicine. Unfortunately, nothing lasts indefinitely, and this movement of Arab science was destined to come to a very slow end. I emphasize slow because, in fact, certain works, I mean particularly the work of another great Persian physician, Rhazes, was reprinted, re-edited, and retranslated in Europe in the 18th century and again in the 19th century. I should add that the great discovery of Rhazes, which was considered particularly urgent in Europe, was the distinction between smallpox and measles. And this was a revolutionary work, the quality of which was appreciated, as I say, for many, many centuries. But by the 17th century, Europe was undergoing what is sometimes known as the scientific revolution. And that means simply that the emphasis was coming to lie far more on personal observation, on personal experimentation, than on the reception of any scientific tradition. And this meant that a series of criticisms of Arabic medicine, Arabic science in general, were slowly accumulating. Questions were raised about the accuracy of certain Arabic translations from the Greek and the validity of certain observations by the Arab physicians. It was, however, replaced, and this is something that we see very clearly, for example, in the collections made by manuscript collectors in Europe. The interest in Arabic science was replaced by a series of other factors. If I use the term intellectual curiosity in the very broadest sense, I think this will cover most of what was going on. But there were various very precise factors which were to have a particularly deep influence. First of all, certain categories of people were traveling more and more frequently to the Arab world. There were, of course, the pilgrims who had always been making their way to Jerusalem and to the various holy places in Egypt and Palestine and the Levant in general. There were missionaries whose field was gradually extending ever further east and ever deeper into the Arab world. There were navigators, there were merchants, there were diplomats. And what is most important of all, of course, is the fact that the Arab world occupied a very, very important strategic position in the gradual expansion of the European powers to the east. So what became of particular importance was the existence of accurate maps, accurate cartography. Now, I've chosen two maps of the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula, in fact, the coast of the Arabian Peninsula was surprisingly well known ever since antiquity. It had been circumnavigated by the Greeks and by the Romans, and one of the standard descriptions of the coastal area, which was still used as a reliable guidebook in the early 20th century, dates from the 1st century of the Christian era by a Greek merchant, and is known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And it describes in very considerable detail, of course it is a question of finding out exactly what the modern equivalents were of the ancient sites that he was describing, but it describes in very considerable detail the coastal cities, mainly of Oman, but also of other parts of the Persian Gulf. Now, this is from a work which appeared in 1680, published by a Dutchman called Olfert Dopper, a very sedentary scholar who had never set foot in any of the numerous countries, descriptions of which he published, and whose aim was really to offer a Dutch version of the great travel anthologies published by Hackett and Purchas in England, by Ramusio in Italy, by Thévenot in France. There were various examples all over Europe. But Dopper is of particular importance because he had the most lavish illustrations, and his aim was to get the most up-to-date descriptions of the various countries which he discussed and the most up-to-date maps. And this is a very, very competent map by 17th century standards of the Arabian Peninsula. But the Arabian Peninsula was only known, as I said, from its coast. And it wasn't until the 19th century that we find, particularly in the case of Oman, I mean, there were other parts of Arabia which had been penetrated by Europeans, and I'll be returning to those slightly later. But in the case of Oman, the first European scholar, soldier, to actually venture into the interior and to draw up a map which by contemporary standards was extremely accurate was Wellsted, James Wellsted, who was in the service of the East India Company. And of course, here immediately we have sort of notes of potential imperialism, because the East India Company, being particularly interested in all places on the route to India, was very, very keen on having the area clearly charted. The interesting thing, or one of the more interesting features of this map, is of course that it's one of the earliest maps on which Abu Dhabi and Dubai are clearly marked. Wellsted, in fact, concentrated his efforts on the exploration of the interior of Oman, but he also ventured further east and further north and became fairly intimately connected with a particularly large area of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, cartography is, as I say, one aspect of the new interest in the Arab world after, let's say, the scientific era, the period in which Arabic influence was limited mainly to science. But there were numerous other factors which played a role. Now, one of the most sort of general ideals of travelers in the Arab world was to present the appearance of the world and to explore certain scientific features of the Arab world. So what we find is European scientists traveling to the Arab world rather than Arabic scientific writings entering Europe. European scientists are traveling to the Arab world from the 16th century onwards and are returning with their findings, zoological findings, geological findings, botanical findings. On the whole, these Europeans were connected with a ruler. Ever since France had established diplomatic relations with Turkey in the early 16th century, the French embassy in Istanbul had been a base for scholars who could then set out, for scientists who could then set out to explore the rest of the Arab world, the Ottoman Empire and the Arab world. And we have various scientific expeditions which increase in grandeur, in ambition, and also, it should be said, in tragedy and disaster. The best known is the famous Niebuhr expedition of 1761, which was financed by the King of Denmark and included some of the most illustrious scholars of the time, botanists, bibliographers, linguists, and all the members of the expedition died fairly soon after they'd reached the Middle East. Most of them died in the Yemen, some of them died in India. But by the end of the exhibition, the only survivor was Caspar Niebuhr, a rather modest figure who was a surveyor, but also an extraordinary survivor, and did the most extraordinarily accurate depictions of the hieroglyphs and of the cuneiform inscriptions in what used to be Babylon, which could be deciphered in Europe. But possibly the best known of the expeditions, the grandest, the most ambitious, was the expedition led by Napoleon when he invaded Egypt in 1798. And Napoleon, who'd always, he used to say, wanted to become a scientist, but had given it up when faced with other possibilities, had assembled a remarkable group of scholars, of scientists, an artist, Redoute, who was famous for his depictions of animals, and the result of his expedition was a book known as the Description de l'Égypte, which appeared in countless volumes between 1809 and 1829. It was the first edition, and which presented every possible aspect of Egypt. I mean, it was mainly concentrated on antiquities. There was also a certain amount on contemporary, well, on Islamic architecture, but there was a great deal on zoology, on the animals, the plants, which were discovered in Egypt. And here we have a spotted eagle, which had been discovered by the botanist Savigny, in fact, a botanist, not a zoologist, and which was then depicted and colored by Redoute on the return of the expedition to Paris. Napoleon's expedition was grand and didn't end in tragedy, but just as Niebuhr's expedition had ended in tragedy, the next great expedition to the Middle East, which dates from the 1820s and is associated, it was patronized by the King of Prussia and was led by a botanist called Ehrenberg, again ended in disaster. Ehrenberg was very fortunate in that he did survive, but all his colleagues died at a fairly early stage of the expedition, which covered a large part of North Africa and also went down the Red Sea. And these Arabian leopards were found in the Asir range in the southern part of what is now Saudi Arabia. And the book which resulted, which came out in 1828, the Symbole of Ehrenberg, is an extraordinarily beautiful object which does illustrate the many, many animals and indeed the plants which he discovered on his travels. First scientists, then the appearance of the animals, the plant life of the Arab world. But then there was also an immense curiosity in other features, such as, for example, the landscapes. Again, I've chosen a landscape which isn't that far away from here, and that is, of course, most of you I'm sure are familiar with it, Muscat. The interesting aspect of this particular depiction of Muscat by Richard Temple is that Richard Temple, like Wellsted, was in the service of the East India Company. He was involved in the raid on Ras El Khaimah in 1809. And on the ship on which he was sailing, there were various artists. He himself was very distinguished, and there were also others. And he took views as he sailed up the coast, as he sailed round to this part of the Arabian coast, which also reflect a certain change of taste in Europe. In 1757, there appeared a book by Edmund Burke on the sublime. And the sublime was an aesthetic category. Burke's theory was that the beautiful or the pretty were charming in themselves, but were actually fairly ineffectual when it came to making an impression on people. What made an impression on people was the sublime, and the sublime was reached by vast spaces, darkness, by a mysterious atmosphere, which inspired a sense of awe in the spectator. And here we can see as we see in countless depictions of the desert, an emphasis on dark mountains, an emphasis in many other depictions, an emphasis on the darkness of the souk, an emphasis on the somewhat mysterious aspect and dramatic aspect of the Arab world, which was found immensely attractive. This is an illustration of the interest in costumes, because the Europeans, who were so curious about the Arab world, wanted more information about every single aspect they could possibly gather. And one, of course, of the aspects was, what did the people actually look like? Now, this illustration, which is by a woman, Helen Mackenzie, reminds us that the Arab world was on the very southern edge of a political phenomenon which is known frequently as the Great Game, and any of you who've read Kipling's Kim will immediately recognize it from the extraordinarily detailed description which Kipling gives. The Great Game, which was simply the struggle for India, or the struggle not only for the country itself, but for the routes and guarding the routes to India, in which the main players were England and Russia. But in fact, other European countries became involved. The main area was the northern route, in other words, through Persia and Afghanistan. But they also passed, the participants in the Great Game, through the southern area on the northern edge of the Arab world. Now, Helen Mackenzie was the wife of a man who, both she and her husband, Colin Mackenzie, survived the siege of Kabul in 1842. And this is a reminder of the fact that the Arab world was just, in its northern stretches, involved in this strange political game of chess, which lasted for most of the 19th century and also for a bit of the 20th century. According to some people, it continued long after. And it's very rare to have an illustration of a Bedouin. It was probably made in the vicinity of Bosra in the south of Iraq, and is one of the illustrations which brought home the importance of the Arab world to a European reading public. Another aspect, of course, of the Arab world which was found fascinating were its towns. Now, there had been various descriptions, which were all extremely successful, of daily life in an Arab city. The most famous is The Natural History of Aleppo, which came out in the second half of the 18th century by the Russell brothers. But then this was followed by the extraordinary description of Mecca and Medina by the Swiss traveler Burckhardt, who converted to Islam and performed the Hajj in the early 19th century, and of course Edward Lane's unforgettable description of Cairo. This is a view of another Arab city. It's a view of Baghdad, made by a gifted amateur traveler, Robert Clive, in the 1830s. Cities. Now, cities brings me to another important aspect of the European interest in the Arab world, and a rather sinister one, I should immediately say, because Europeans had been maturing an extraordinarily acquisitive attitude towards the Arab world from a relatively early stage. Leibniz, the great philosopher, had already advised Louis XIV of France to just take over Egypt completely. It wasn't quite clear what was supposed to happen with the local inhabitants, but certainly the French were to take over the entire country and to change it beyond recognition to their own pleasure. There is an ambassador who set out for France, a French ambassador who sent out for Istanbul in the 1830s, and he announced that the object of his expedition was to divest the East of all its rarities and all its manuscripts. And this was indicative of the European attitude. There's also, if you read the diplomatic instructions to the various travelers in the Arab world, you find very, very sinister plans afoot. I mean, one of the best known was a German called Wansleben, who was traveling in French service in the late 17th century. And Wansleben, in fact, was supposed to go to Ethiopia, something which he never did. He was also supposed to collect Ethiopian antiquities, which of course he couldn't do because he never got to Ethiopia. But on the way, he was supposed to excavate single-handed Baalbek, Ephesus, and Nicaea, and send back to France all the antiquities he could possibly lay his hands on. He was supposed to capture every animal he saw and send it back to France, preferably alive, but otherwise stuffed. He was supposed to copy every inscription, make detailed plans of every single building, and collect every manuscript and every object of art that he could lay his hands on. Of course, Wansleben, being these labors of Hercules, were way beyond his capacity, and so he simply ended up by making the greatest collection of Coptic manuscripts, Coptic Arabic and Coptic, which are now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And for this, he received no thanks and no reward. Colbert, who issued the original instructions, said that Wansleben hadn't done any of the things he was supposed to do. Above all, he'd never reached Ethiopia. And so he ended his life in penury in France. But this particular picture by an artist famous for his depictions of the Middle East, David Roberts, the Scotch artist, is of Petra in Jordan, and that emphasizes the interest in Europe primarily in Greek and Roman ruins, because of course Greek and Roman ruins were a constant reminder that many parts of the Arab world had once been in the hands of the Greeks and the Romans, and it played an enormously important part in propaganda. I mean, when the French invaded Algeria in 1830, there was a preparation in which the French were reminded that Algeria, of course, was still a Roman settlement, and that it was beckoning sadly across the Mediterranean, begging the French to go back there and save it from subsequent invasions. Gradually, but only very gradually, and we'll come to this in a second, the preference of Europeans extended also to other monuments. But David Roberts was protected by a man who was going to play a very, very important part, possibly unwittingly, in the European discovery of the Arab world and also in the transference of knowledge. And this was the ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, the Albanian ruler of Egypt in the early 19th century. Now, Muhammad Ali had protected Roberts on his peregrinations in Egypt and also in other parts of the Arab world. And he protected another artist. Muhammad Ali wasn't interested in artists. Muhammad Ali wanted European technicians. And in Pascal Coste, a Frenchman who produced this picture among many, many others, he found an engineer, and Pascal Coste, his main service to Muhammad Ali was to dig the Mahmoudiya Canal from Alexandria to the Nile, and also create a telegraph system between Alexandria and Cairo. But Pascal Coste himself was interested in Islamic architecture. And now here we have the fruition of what had long been an interest in Islam due to comparative religions, due to the immense area covered by Islam. But up to Pascal Coste, very, very few depictions had been produced of the interiors of mosques. There weren't that many of the exteriors of mosques either. Some mosques were clearly far more accessible than others. I mean, the Turkish mosques were clearly accessible already in the late 17th century, and one of the first artists to produce pictures of them was a Frenchman called Grelot. But Pascal Coste was given permission. Whether he was actually guarded is not clear. Certainly when the members of the Napoleonic expedition took their views of mosques, they had a military guard. But Pascal Coste was allowed into the mosques. This is the famous early 15th century mosque of Muayyad Sheikh in Cairo. And for the first time, a European readership could get a very, very clear idea of what went on inside a mosque. There had been various suggestions, there had been various illustrations of Muslim rituals and prayers, but very, very, very little indeed on the interiors of mosques. And this was thanks to the protection of Muhammad Hadi. Now, the one country which was really very accessible to European travelers and which also stimulated an enormous interest in Islam, in the Arab world, and it acted as an induction into the Arab world, was Spain. Now, in the exhibition organized by the British Museum, you'll find another, I'm not quite sure if it's exactly the same one, a sketch of this picture, which is by John Frederick Lewis, an artist who was particularly popular in England at the time, and who would fall in love with the Arab world. But the first stage of this love affair was a visit in the 1830s to the Alhambra, the great Nasrid, the 13th century Nasrid palace in Granada. And this is a view of it. And Lewis was one of several European artists working there at the same time. This is by a Frenchman, another view of the Alhambra, Giraud de Prangé. And the result of these illustrations of the Spanish Islamic heritage was a very considerable revolution in European design. The various motifs that were depicted, usually in very considerable detail, here they're not completely clear, but usually they are in much, much greater detail, were introduced into fabrics, they were used in architecture, they were used as decorative motifs throughout Europe. Now, this glittering civilization, this civilization which had produced the greatest medieval scientists, which had produced some of the greatest, well, produced, maybe it's the wrong word, which had some of the most exciting landscapes, some of the most thrilling architecture in the world. Obviously, questions were being asked about its literature. Did the Arab world have a literature? Now, the answer, strange enough, in the late 17th century would have been no, not really, or anyhow not a literature that could possibly appeal to Europeans. The idea was that nearly all texts in Arabic were scientific, some of them were philosophical. Poetry was known, there had been studies of Arabic poetry, but poetry, of course, is extremely difficult to translate, and so very, very few people could possibly appreciate Arabic poetry. There had been translations of the Arabic proverbs, and there had been translations of certain literary works. The Maqamat of Hariri, for example, was translated repeatedly at the time, but very, very little. And so we have various statements by Arabists in the late 17th century saying, you know, we've spent such a long time and so much effort in learning Arabic. Is there anything worth reading in it? Well, not perhaps really. Now, this, of course, changed completely in 1700. It changed completely with the work with which certainly the New York University in Dubai is profoundly familiar, the arrival in Europe of the texts which became known as the Arabian Nights. Now, I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to conclude with this particular image and this particular event, but I'm not going to go into detail about the Arabian Nights, but I would like to emphasize a certain point. And that is that its extraordinary success in Europe was one of the most productive misunderstandings in the encounters between cultures. Misunderstandings why? European collectors of manuscripts, European Arabists had, ever since the mid-17th century, been searching for a canon of Arabic literature. They'd been writing to their friends in the Arab world. They'd been asking what manuscripts they should collect. They'd been asking what sort of manuscripts, what sort of field they should concentrate on. The answers they received were, on the whole, fairly unsatisfactory. When finally the Europeans well, when finally an answer was provided, it was provided by the Europeans themselves in the 19th century and then somehow recycled to the Arab world. But the point of this misunderstanding was that the Europeans were profoundly interested in certain cultural fields which were not highly rated in the Arab world. I mean, if we look at the sort of, let's say, a hypothetical gentleman's library of an Arab manuscript collector in the 17th century, we'll find a very great emphasis on theology, jurisprudence, science, adib being culture, but that would of course be lexicography and various other forms of literature which don't fall into the other categories. What would come very low on the list would be history, which of course was of enormous interest to Europeans as a part of the curiosity in the world in general and their efforts to reconstruct the history of the Arab world. History occupied a low place, and I think that if we had among us a board of 17th century Arab scholars, they would all agree in saying that there was one work which nobody should read, and that was the Arabian Nights. Now, this is something which we do find repeated in Arabic literature. I mean, if you look at fairly recent writers, the 20th century Egyptian writers, Hussein, Tawfiq al-Hakim, you'll find that there is a very general condemnation of the Arabian Nights. I mean, in one of Tah Hussein's best-known novels, Da al-Karwan, there's a description of a father who discovers that his sons, whom he believed were scholars, that they actually had a copy of the Arabian Nights amongst their books. And at that point, he tears it up brutally and throws it into the flames, sacks the servants who were involved in getting the copy, and beats his sons. So there was a feeling that the Arabian Nights were reading matter for women and for children. Now this, of course, is exactly what was felt about novels in Europe in the 18th century, particularly in the early 18th century, but very gradually they accumulated respectability. The Arabian Nights in Europe had the most extraordinary success. I mean, certainly by the 19th century, if you look at Victorian literature, it was probably the work quoted more than any other short of the Bible. It was a work that had the most extraordinary success, but it was, as I said, a work based on a marvelous misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, and as I say, misunderstandings are very, very frequent when one culture meets another, a misunderstanding which was quite extraordinarily productive. Thank you very much.
Artists that would come from Europe to the Middle East and would draw these beautiful paintings of the Middle East.
Yes.
It's known that none of these are extremely accurate because the intention is to romanticize it, to make...
Yes, that's right. Yes.
These books, how aren't they under the same influence? I mean, whoever expedition they would come, they want to bring back information that is very, very interesting to whoever is paying for the expedition. So how reliable is the information in these books, whether it's picture, even if it's scientific, even if it's like a description of a bird? I mean, how reliable? How do you check it? How do you know that these specimens really existed at the time? How do you know that these mountains, I mean, you know what I mean?
Yes, I know exactly what you mean, and thank you very much. It's a very, very good question. I mean, it varies enormously. Obviously, nowadays, if it's a question of landscapes, in the case of Muscat, for example, it's perfectly possible to see that that's rather a good representation. That's what it still looks like, or part of it anyhow. So it varies very, very much. I think you can probably say that the sort of amateur painter, and Richard Temple was an amateur painter, were probably more reliable than the professionals. Now, David Roberts, on the other hand, well, some of them, I mean, they're marvelous pictures. But his famous picture of people praying on the Dome of the Mount, which you probably know in Jerusalem, is wildly inaccurate. I mean, that's not what it looks like. That's not how people pray. And I mean, there are series, if you want to collect the various mistakes in that picture, you can spend a very entertaining evening. And now, this is true of a certain amount, but as I say, it's impossible to generalize about that. I mean, Some, I think, are extremely accurate. Lewis, I would have thought on the whole was accurate. I mean, you're quite right. He was, of course, he was painting to sell. He wanted a pretty picture. So if you want a pretty picture, you are going to betray any elements. And this was something that was very, very much held against Pascal Coste and the artists who illustrated the Description de l'Égypte. Because what was said was that that wasn't exactly what the mosques looked like. But having said that, one should also add that the Pascal Coste illustrations were used to very, very good effect to restore buildings in Cairo. I mean, so the sort of the cleanliness which you find in some of the descriptions, in some of the depictions of mosques in the Description d'Egypte, and which was very much held against them because it didn't seem to reproduce at all the reality of the situation. This is something which wasn't necessarily entirely negative. And Pascal Coste, and he wasn't alone, had a very considerable influence. When many of these buildings collapsed, and the Moayed Sheikh Mosque partially collapsed fairly shortly after he depicted it and was then rebuilt, his pictures were very much relied on. He also did pictures, of course, of the Persian mosques and a great many of the other Cairene mosques. So, I mean, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but it's about the only one I can give.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture, very interesting. I'm curious about alchemy coming out of the Arab world and into Europe, sort of an underground or secret knowledge or not mainstream science. So I'd just be curious if you could talk a little bit about that, please.
Alchemy. Mysterious and underground? You use those words. Yes. Well, I mean, alchemy was quite similar to chemistry, of course. I mean, until modern chemistry came into existence. So there wasn't really anything particularly mysterious about it underground. If, of course, you were laboring away to establish gold from various pieces of mud, then, well, spend a great deal of time with absolutely no results. And you could say that around that there was built a certain myth of the alchemist, who then sort of ends up, like Ben Jonson's alchemist, exploding. But normally speaking, I mean, it was a perfectly respectable form of chemistry for a very long time indeed. I mean, there was nothing sort of subversive about it at all. Now, of course, that it has been replaced by chemistry, it's regarded as highly subversive because it's not serious chemistry. I never really, well, it's not fair to say that it never really was, because, I mean, some of the various features of chemistry did already exist in alchemy and were then expanded upon. I hope that's satisfactory as an answer, because I'm not a scientist, and I'd hate to say something about alchemy which wasn't correct.
Say something about the origin of the Arcadian Collection and who owns it?
Well, there, you know, St. Augustine said that there was one question which one wasn't supposed to ask, and I think you've just asked it, because there's not much I can say about the Arcadian Collection. It's a beautiful library in London, owned by a businessman, and it is, I must say, one of the best collections illustrating relations between Europe and the Arab world. It's a private library, so it's not open to the general public. And the person who knows most about it is Dr. Robert Jones, who's sitting just there, because he collected it. I don't know if there's much more I can tell you. What we've got an extraordinary range of printed books, which cover really the whole of the Islamic world. We've got some very, very good manuscripts, well, some manuscripts, which are of great interest. One of the ones that I showed you, the Zahrawi one, is a very rare manuscript. A splendid and almost unique map of Cairo dating from the early 16th century, which I think there are only other 2 copies in the world. Then a certain amount of material on the Gulf, which is very interesting, which hasn't really been studied properly. And can you think of other features, Robert, that I should? Travel, yes, well, travel. Turkica. Yes, a very important, yes, I'd rather sort of left out Turkica because I didn't think it was particularly relevant to what I was going to say. But there is an enormous collection of Turkish pamphlets from about 1480 to 1750, but mainly around the Battle of Lepanto in the 16th century.
It's all translated books. Are there any manuscripts that are in Arabic original?
Good point. No, they're not all translated. There are a great many translations, but what we also have, of course, are the European books printed in Arabic. So we've got an entire collection of the publications of the Medici press in the 16th century, the publications produced in Rome in the late 16th century, complete works of Avicenna, there's a grammar, works on geography, and so on. There we've got a complete collection. We've got well, not totally complete, but a very good collection of the Suede. You know what I mean by the Suede products? The Suede products were printed by Christians in the Lebanon in the 18th century. I mean, they went into the 19th century. And they are typographically very interesting because they're the first examples of the successful introduction of typography into the Arab world. Then we have, I mean, by the 17th century, Arabic was being printed in Europe very, very widely, and we have not perhaps all, but a very, very great number of what was published in Arabic. Yes.
So the oldest manuscript is?
The oldest manuscript is the one I showed you, 1300. Do we have anything else? Oh, we have one that is slightly earlier.
Yes, it's
the Batlan? Abu Mashar, yes. How will it, yes. 12th century. Ibn Baklarish, which is, the manuscript is 1100? 1130, yes. That is important. The Ibn Baklarish manuscript is important because Ibn Baklarish was a Jewish physician in Muslim Spain, and it has a combination, you there see a combination of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian medical ideas, because it also has marginalia later added.
When did the Arabic language first get written? And two, what influence did the invention of the printing press have on Arab countries? And where did it first get used? What city did it first get used?
I'm sorry, when you say when was Arabic first written, there I hesitate to answer that question because I don't think anybody knows the exact answer, but certainly, I mean, by the 7th century it was being written, by the 7th century. But printing, of course, is a completely different matter. It was first printed in Europe, first with woodcuts. We find woodcuts already in the late 15th and early 16th century. Then movable type, we get that in 1520s, 1514, I stand correct, 1514. That's the first time actual print was used, movable print in Rome by the missionaries for circulation amongst the Arabic-speaking Christians. Then, sorry, your question went on. That's for Arabic printing, but then you ask what influence?
First printed in Arab countries.
When did printing start in Arab countries? Very late, very late. There were abortive attempts to introduce it, which had absolutely no, particularly in Turkey, actually, not in the Arab world, in the 18th century. But it starts in the Arab world with the French invasion of Egypt in the 1798, and then in Bulaq, which is the sort of port of Cairo on the Nile, there a printing press came into existence in the first years of the 19th century, run by French scholars in collaboration with Egyptians. That's when it starts. Then after that, everything changes. But before that, of course, it's a manuscript culture. And this is one of the reasons the Europeans had such difficulty in establishing a canon, in knowing what texts they ought to publish, what texts they ought to read. It was just a question of luck. What could you find, in a mosque that was raided? You help yourself to its library. But it just depends. So it was very fortuitous.
I'm fascinated with the perspective the Europeans had of this area, and also how did that relate to their interest in other areas of the world? For example, the Asian world. Was there a predisposition towards things Arabic at the cost of interest in other parts of the world? I'm fascinated also, you were talking about these expeditions that went to this area. Now that was about the same time as Cook was going to Oceania. It was the sort of time that the voyage of the Beagle. So I'm just wondering whether there was a general interest of all things around the world, or was there a special interest by the Europeans in this area?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. The answer is, I mean, surveys have been done on this for the 16th century and the 17th century. And what is striking is that there's a preponderance of interest for the Islamic world. Far more. I mean, I can't remember the exact statistics, but certainly, let's say that there might be 60% interest in the Islamic world, which includes the Turkish world and, of course, the Arab world, and far, far less, almost no interest in America, strangely enough, despite the recent discovery of the continent, and very little interest in Africa. A little more interest in Asia, but not that much more. So it dominates. The interest in the Arab world and in the Islamic world dominates book production in the 16th, 17th, I would say almost up, yes, into the 18th century too.
A supplementary question. From what you were saying, it would appear that the Europeans had a fascination early on and a respect almost of the knowledge that the Arabic peoples had.
Yes.
But I got the impression, and is it true, that it then swung to a rapaciousness and just wanting to use whatever was there, and almost a contempt for the people, but just wanting to take whatever the Europeans could get out of the area, and that initial respect was lost?
I think it's impossible to give one answer to that question. I mean, again, it varied enormously from place to place, from moment to moment. There were times, I mean, there are countless examples of sheer rapacity, yes. But I believe, I mean, I know that it's fashionable to sort of say that the West has been entirely and uniquely rapacious. I don't think this is altogether true. I mean, very, very frequently. And I tend to regard this really as the majority of cases. We find a disinterested curiosity in the rest of the world, which wasn't accompanied by contempt. I mean, one has to be rather careful about contempt, because every civilization thinks it's infinitely superior to any other civilization. Every nation thinks it's infinitely superior to its neighbors. So, I mean, this question of contempt, one has to, I think, treat with a certain caution. Certainly, yes, sometimes you do find elements of contempt. One can't deny that. But I wouldn't say that it was prevalent. And I would say respect. I mean, the general sort of line about the Arab world by the 18th century was, we all agree that the Arabs had produced the greatest scientists in Europe for a very long period of time. Now there's been a decline. Now that is something that we do find repeatedly. And now scholars are trying to establish exactly what that meant.
Thank you very much. I have a general question. What we've seen in this cultural encounter, which is characterized by a kind of a one-sided representation, Europe representing the Middle East or the Orient over several centuries, not just a representation, but analysis on many different levels, certainly by the 19th century. For example, someone like Owen Jones,
very, very much case in point, of course, because he was so influenced by the designs of the Alhambra.
Absolutely, yeah. And he not only represented but analyzed Islamic architecture.
Yes, yes.
My point is that this thickness of description over several centuries, to what extent has it actually replaced or mediated the reality itself? So that, for example, one example that I can give, that mosques that were being built in the late 19th century in the Ottoman Empire were no longer looking at other mosques before them, but they were looking at Owen Jones. So that he became the
feedback. You mean the feedback?
The veil through which to see the culture.
Yes.
Can one generalize to see that we are no longer able to see Arab culture because of the thickness of this description?
As I said about Pascal Coste, the feedback was, I think, I mean, if I understand your question right, you're asking me to what extent European developments affected Islamic architecture, for example, and things like that. The knowledge which had been brought from the Arab world, to what extent was it fed back to the Arab world? Well, as I said, in the case of Pascal Coste, I mean, his designs were essential for the reconstruction of a town like Cairo, which was not necessarily undertaken by Egyptians, but was undertaken to a very large extent by Europeans. In fact, it was a Hungarian who was responsible for much of the reconstruction of Cairo in the late 19th century. So there you have a clear example. Turkey, I would always regard as slightly outside. I mean, I think it's an obvious thing to say, outside the Arab world, and that the Turks did prove extremely receptive to European influences from the 18th century onwards, much, much more than the Arab world actually did. I mean, they were already collecting, of course, information about weapons, armaments, military strategy, and things like that. Those were being absorbed in Turkey long before they were being absorbed in the Arab world. I hesitate to go any further in my answer. But,
my question might have an obvious answer, but when you showed that map with Abu Dhabi on it, it said
yes.
The pirate coast. I was just wondering why.
Well, I mean, that, of course, is why Richard Temple arrived on his boat to bombard Ras El Khaimah. The pirate coasts, I mean, it's very much disputed whether they were pirates. Say, piracy is as you know, a very elastic term. Everybody was a pirate. The English were probably the worst pirates of all. Well, the French and the Dutch were doing pretty well too, but the English were extremely bad from that point of view. The idea was that Omani shipping was being brutally interrupted, and this also included the shipping of the East India Company from India to the Arabian coast, was being brutally interrupted by raids which set off from Ras El Khaimah and from tribes in this part of the peninsula. Now, the tribes in this part of the peninsula didn't agree at all, of course, on the fact that they were pirates. They said they were simply protecting their own commercial interests. I mean, this is a typical situation where piracy is concerned. They were defending their own commercial interests, which were brutally threatened by the East Indian Company and by Omani shipping. And so the East India Company moved in alliance with Oman and attacked what they thought were the pirates. And since the pirates were assembled in this part of the peninsula, it became known as the Pirate Coast. Thank you very much indeed.